Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna-Marie and today I'm going to do a video about utopian socialism. This video is inspired by, I could only find two, but she might have done more because TikTok is not very good for like actually looking at older like videos and things. But My Name is Marina's series called like books about some kind of theme or topic, like grief or vampires, which are the two I've linked in the description box, but if I find any more I'll link them as well. That I rated 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 stars, and she, you know, goes from 1 star to 5 stars and kind of talks about them. I really love that idea, so I thought I would do it because now I've read like enough books to cover the whole 1 to 5 star ratings, that is. Then I would do a video where I talk about books that are utopian socialist in some capacity, all of which are fiction books, so this isn't about like non-fiction discussions of utopianism and socialism and what that is and stuff. And yeah, before I kind of talk about the books, I did think it might be useful to kind of talk a bit about utopian socialism as like a ideology, a practice. I would love to present you with like a concise and clear definition of it, but in a way that's kind of utopian socialist of me. So instead I'll just say like a couple things about it. I think generally like utopian socialism was a sort of a movement that people engaged in on the left like during the late Victorian era into the early 19th century. But you know, I'm sure you can argue that it's longer and in both directions than that. All of these books though are from 1890 to 1913, but it was only published in 1971. And I would say that in contrast to kind of more like scientific socialism and also more kind of like democratic socialism or like sort of Marxist Federation type socialism, it's much more like loose and kind of quite queer in that respect. It is sometimes a bit too focused on like the individual, so on like things like practices of vegetarianism, but they all kind of gesture towards a different relationship with like land, people and food. And there is something, whilst I don't know how well it was necessarily like explored or demonstrated, there was something anti-imperialist about utopian socialist practices, and sort of like the ethics of humanity is being questioned there. And it, you know, included space for like dissident sexual expression. So Edward Carpenter is like a really famous utopian socialist, and yeah, his like queerness and his defense of gay people was all part of his political beliefs too. Obviously, like that makes sense, but then I mean like explicitly his socialist beliefs too, like it's all part of like comradeship. So you can kind of tell why I really love it and think it's really interesting. And it also, I would say, includes, although this was also happening in other kinds of socialist and leftist communities, but it does also have like, because it is kind of focused on individuals, it is also then focused on different ways of living like in space together. So that means that there were like these settlements of people living together communally and like doing that as a way to change social life and like the stratification of class society. I think it's a pretty like middle class thing, but I also still think that there is some worth in the ideas and the ways of living that it's putting forward, but they obviously still always, as usual, need to be examined. I was also kind of thinking about it as a sort of like, it's almost like an anarchist form of socialism, and I think maybe some people, I mean I suppose I did include William Morris in this, who maybe wouldn't be necessarily always included as a utopian socialist, but he is interested in utopia and in living differently, and that's very much present, even if he was like the most conservative about things like, I don't know, free love, women, marriage, heterosexuality, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's pretty like nebulous I guess, but we'll see. The other reason that it took me a while to do this is because I had to justify to myself giving these books their various star ratings, and I did that by basically giving them half points. So the first one that I said is 1 star is 1.5 stars, but I think it counts as 1 star. And also, I don't really know, maybe it is just a 1 star book. But that first book is News from Nowhere by William Morris, which was first published in 1890. It's about a man who's like the narrator called William Guest, waking up in the future in a utopian society and kind of like being taken around by various people in it and finding out about how they got to where they are, how they live. Parliament is like a dung market, there's no money, there's no prisons anymore, which is great. But the reason why I gave this 1 star, 1.5 stars, is because of the way that like it completely misses the boat on like women like at all. Like there's a couple women characters who the narrator interacts with, and mostly yeah, it's mostly focused on this younger woman. Like the main character's like 50 or something, or like, you know, he's not a young man, and he like meets this young woman who's probably like maybe in her early 20s, and is just like obsessed with how beautiful she is. And like that's also why I dislike it, because William Morris is so obsessed with like the aesthetics of socialism that he like doesn't really, like, he loses the point of actual socialism, because he's like, oh, everybody should be able to look at beautiful things, but like, okay, but like that doesn't mean creepy men can just like stare at young women all the time. And there's also this other woman who's like a bit older, but also, yeah, because like their lives are so much better. Everybody, but especially the women, are much more beautiful because they don't have to experience the ravages of life which like harm their beautiful faces. Yeah, and there's this other woman that William Guest talks to, and she's just like, oh, like, why would we want, like, this is maybe a bit paraphrased because I did read this a while ago, but like, oh, why would we want like birth control or like contraception or any of that stuff? Like, now we all just, you know, love it. And like none of the actual work that women do, like, it's all completely naturalized into society. It's almost a bit like Thomas More's Utopia, which is just like so flawed in that respect too, in how like work and gender is even happening. But yeah, so that just really annoyed me, and I felt like there was a lot of potential, but it was mostly fucked over by the misogyny. I think if you are interested in utopian socialism, and I guess William Morris, which people tend to be, you know, it is still like an interesting book to read. It's just also a very frustrating one because it just feels very like male and patriarchal, and like, yeah. The book I gave 2 stars to is Attainment by Edith Ellis, which is from 1909, and it's set in the sort of 1890s, and it's about a young woman called Rachel who moves from, I'm not sure if it's in the south or the north, but from sort of like the countryside to London, and she's just kind of trying to figure out the best way to live her life and the best way to help people. She engages in like lots of different kinds of sort of philanthropic work. She also is interested in politics. It also includes some great lines about like how reading Capital by Marx is just like a slog, and I really respected it for including that. And there are lots of discussions with various like comrades and things, and yeah, so she is also then swept up by people who they actually sort of parody or are like representations of people who were members of the Fellowship of the New Life, which is something that Edward Carpenter was in, which was like this utopian socialist organisation from which the Fabian Society, which is much more famous today, kind of split off from. The Fabian Society did so because they wanted to focus on like sort of reform versus total kind of spiritual comradeship, which is what the Fellowship of the New Life was going for. You know, I don't think either of those societies were necessarily particularly successful, but I do much prefer the Fellowship of the New Life because the Fabian Society aren't really socialist at all, and also end up being like really eugenicist, although, I mean, you could definitely still be a eugenicist and a Fellowship of the New Life person. Anyway, I got a bit distracted there. Yeah, so in Attainment, Rachel, she then participates in this house, like a communal house for various people, and it is just about that. I think the reason I gave this 2 stars is like twofold, I guess. One is just that like I expected it to be gayer, so it was like a disappointment to me, and the reason I expected that is because Edith Ellis was queer at the time, and also in comparison with other queer women she tended to be like much more or like much less like ashamed of her sexuality. And she was also the wife of Havelock Ellis, who's this like famous sexologist who used her as a case study in his work on like inversion, or I don't think actually he's the one who's using necessarily the language of inversion, but you know, sexological kind of distinctions between like queerness and non-queerness. And yeah, he used his wife as case study in that, which is interesting. I wasn't like there's going to be explicit gay sex the whole way through, but I was like, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of vibes. And maybe like you could read some of the vibes in there, but it just was like very heterosexual, especially the ending. And you know, the other reason why it's 2 stars is just because it took me ages to read, and like it's not particularly captivating. And it is interesting to read about people's conversations about this kind of stuff, but I think it becomes almost like being in one of those organising meetings where you're just like desperate for people to stop talking and to stop saying the same point over and over again, and you know, you just want to go home. I also did read this on like line because I couldn't find a physical copy of it, which I do think like affected my enjoyment of the reading process, because I really don't like reading stuff online, and that's also why it took me so long to read. But the book I gave 3 stars to is On the Threshold by Isabella Ford, and I think I probably would give it 3.5 stars. When was this published? I think this was published in the 1890s, maybe like 1893, but it is set in the 1880s, and it's about these two art students, one of whom is like a musician and the other is a painter, I think, or something like that, but they're both like arty, and they are two young women and they moved to London, they live together, and it's about them. I guess like the main focus is on the interactions with like socialist male comrades and on this one specific but also like working class women in general, because they are both like middle class. It is quite like a slight novel, like it didn't take me long to read. I think this is a book where it's kind of clumsy in what it's attempting to explore, especially I guess from a modern perspective, but it is also quite like sweet in a way. Both of the young students, one of whom is called Kitty and the other who is called Lucretia, they are, you know, they're both socialists, they're like both ardent socialists, and they go to these socialist meetings and they kind of have discussions about the home and women and the proletariat and the revolution, and they also have very explicit conversations about like gendered work, and these men are like, oh, we should all start a house, and they're like, oh yeah, great, we should, and how are we gonna like share the labour of the house? And the men are all like, oh well, can't do that, we're going to be doing the hard work. And then they're just kind of like, oh, you mean like the hard work of, you know, I don't know, cleaning the fireplaces and all of that physical domestic work that is actually like very time intensive and difficult? And they're like, oh no, well, we couldn't do that. So that's really interesting in my perspective, and it also is a lot more queer than either of the other two that I've talked about so far, which I really enjoyed. I definitely think if you're interested in kind of like spinsterhood energy, this is a book for you. For me, aside I guess from the queerness, which I do find really interesting, especially because there's like an aunt figure who's kind of interesting as well, that sort of like doubles or like mirrors Lucretia a bit. The figure that I'm most interested in really is like Beatrice, who's described as like a maid of all work, and Kitty and Lucretia kind of try to reform her into like a respectable working class person rather than a member of like the lumpen proletariat, and it's because she doesn't think that work is good, and I really loved that. I liked how there was a kind of like dissident voice in the text that isn't necessarily like taken up really by Isabella Ford or by the narrator, but who is still there and who kind of maintains that like there isn't anything like ethically great about working every day of your life or like doing particular kinds of work. And yeah, I really like that. So I think that's really interesting, and the book, yeah, is really interested in the relationship between working class and middle class women and whether they can work together, you know, in solidarity, in comradeship. I feel like talking about it makes it sound like maybe it's more than a 3-star book, but I think it ultimately is just like too slight to be maybe more than that, because it is discussing quite a lot of things, but it has to do so in like a brief way, and even in quite like a caricature way. Well, yeah, maybe that's not quite fair, but like in a bit of a archetypal way. But I do think it's definitely worth reading, and if you have read it, I would love to hear what you thought about it. The next book is The Image Breakers by Gertrude Dix, which is from 1900, and this one I definitely have spoken about. I think I've spoken about On the Threshold too, in like a video also kind of about like the new woman and utopian socialism that I made when I was writing my dissertation. But yeah, The Image Breakers kind of gets 4 stars because it is more like juicy, there's just more to it, which is good when you have a novel that is exploring 2 kind of main characters, although one of them is more of a main character than the other, and the relationship to all sorts of things, but especially to, you know, men, work, money and socialism. The Image Breakers kind of tells the story of Rosalind Dangerfield, that's her last name, who is the wife of a wealthy, you know, capitalist factory owner, and Leslie Arden, who is like living with her aunts in Bristol, or like, I don't think it's ever actually said that, but it's pretty much Bristol, which is where Gertrude Dix is from. And their 2 paths kind of cross at the beginning, they get radicalised together, and then it's sort of about following where they go from there and how they make meaning in their life, how they live with integrity or whether they do or not, and how they like come to understand their like womanhood or like their position as women in respect to society as a whole, I guess. It is also like a clumsy novel. It's, you know, definitely got some major issues I think with it, but I also think it's really a fascinating one. It's also interesting to have remembered the art student part of On the Threshold and how this also is about art to some degree, because Leslie Arden is trying to make money out of illustration when she moves to London, and I've always thought that there is something there about her art, but I haven't ever quite like figured out what exactly is being said. The reason why I gave this book 4 stars as well, I think, is because it is also like a kind of queer text, at least especially at the beginning. There's a lot of potential, which is never necessarily realised, but that it's also part of an exploration of like being a woman socialist, that there's a lot of potential for liberation, but it's never quite realised, in part because male socialists get in the way, basically. Gender itself blocks the path to total social transformation. Yeah, it also is exploring kind of like living alternatively in, I guess, various different ways. The two main ones are kind of like communal living, which is a path that like Rosalind goes towards, and also free love unions, which obviously could be combined, and Leslie Ardent goes the way of the free love union. And I think that's really interesting because there's also like a moment when she worries that she could be pregnant, which is never a moment I had read in a Victorian novel where like it wasn't that we were following like a fallen woman, or you know, it's supposed to be some scandalous story. Instead, like, it was just quite a almost like mundane sort of, oh well, what if this is happening to me, or like, I'm so glad that this isn't happening to me, which I thought was really interesting. So yeah, it has a lot going for it, even if it's also like not a particularly great novel and is kind of clunky, and it's partially because of the politics of the novel that like the plot doesn't quite work. I think especially like the ending. I don't find it particularly convincing for Leslie's ending, not that I'll say what happened or anything. Yeah, I do really like Rosalind. I do think that there's also somewhat of like a patronising approach towards working class people in the book, including sex workers. You know, there's definitely some like Beatrice from On the Threshold connections too. It's also kind of hard for me to think about The Image Breakers and On the Threshold separately, because I did think about them intertwined for my dissertation. But yeah, so onto my 5-star book, which is Maurice by Ian Forster, because how could I not? Maurice is just one of the like most exquisite books I've ever read, and I'm so glad that we get to read it. So Maurice was originally written in 1913 to 14, I think, but it was also actually like edited a lot over the whole decades that it wasn't published, and then it was only published posthumously in 1971 or something like that, I think. But I actually read this amazing article about sort of the afterlives of Maurice, which is also about the new novel called Alec that has come out. But I will leave that link below because it's just such a wonderful novel, and it talks about how Maurice was creating these like gay writer networks throughout, especially I think the 50s and 60s, because Forster would like send like the manuscript to various gay writers who would then also be inspired by it, whilst also kind of like participating in this sort of editing, like transnational editing process and community of gay writers, which is just really lovely. But yeah, so Maurice is about the main character, who's called Maurice, and he is just like some guy. He's like middle class, I think, and you know, it's just kind of about his coming of age. He goes to like a boys' school, he goes to university, and at university he meets someone who's called Clive. That's his name, I think, yeah. And Clive kind of changes his life quite a lot. But Clive is also like a problem for the novel and for the character. And yeah, I'm just going to go on from there. And in a way, like, I can't really talk to you about the utopian socialist elements of it because I don't want to like spoil how delightfully they come into the narrative, or like how delightfully they shape, especially the ending. But it's just really luscious and special, and yeah, just this really wonderful gay rejection of like normativity and capitalism that, yeah, it's just really loving and nice. Good. Yeah, those are 5 books about utopian socialism that I gave 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 stars. Yeah, like I said at the beginning, I'll leave a link to like mynameismarines' TikTok and also her booktube channel. The series was on TikTok, but you know, she's a really great and thoughtful booktuber, so I definitely recommend checking her out, although I'm sure you know her. But yeah, I hope you're having a great day when you watch this. And you know, if you want to talk to me about utopian socialism in any capacity, definitely do. I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye!